Years after the war ended, an Australian sergeant who had guarded a prisoner of war camp in the central west of New South Wales was asked why nobody there had expected an escape, and he answered honestly. The prisoners had nowhere to go. Japan was too far. They ate what the Australians ate, and all they had to do was wait out the war, the way the Italians in the next compound were waiting. It was such a ridiculous thought on our part, he said, that they would even try it. 1,104 Japanese prisoners were held in one compound at Cowra. At 10 minutes to 2 on the morning of the 5th of August, 1944, somewhere between 900 and 1,000 of them came at the wire at once, carrying baseball bats and filed down kitchen knives, and about 350 got through. Half an hour later, 231 of them were dead, 18 huts were burning, and 2 Australian guards had been beaten to death on a machine gun trailer. The government imposed an immediate press ban. The medals were withheld for 6 years. Tell me in the comments, had you ever heard of the Cowra Breakout before today? Because what you are about to discover will make you question what a country owes the men it has already decided it cannot use. Now let's go. To understand what happened inside that compound, you must first understand what a Japanese prisoner of war actually was in 1944, and why the men guarding them could not see it. The old warrior code of the samurai class, Bushido, had been taken up again in the early 1900s, taught in schools and in military training, and fused with emperor worship and the nationalism of the 1930s, until it had become something the men who first wrote it would not have recognized. Under the version taught to the soldiers who fought in the Pacific, surrender was not a misfortune. It was an erasure. A man who was captured had failed in the one obligation that mattered, and the only route back to honor ran through his own death. But the men in that compound had not surrendered. That is the fact the whole story turns on, and almost nobody in Australia understood it. Most of them had been taken in New Guinea, in a campaign that stripped an army down to nothing before the Allies ever reached it. Malaria. Malnutrition that turned men into outlines of themselves. Wounds dressed badly, or not at all. By the time the Australians found them, a great many were unconscious or close to it, past the point where resistance of any kind was physically available to them. Not men who had thrown down their weapons, not men who had weighed the odds and decided to live, but men who had been insensible when the decision was taken out of their hands. They were carried out. And a man who is carried out of a jungle while insensible has still, by the standard he was raised on, failed to die. So they gave false names. If the record said a man had been captured, the record could reach Japan, and his family would then have to live with what he had done. Better that they be told nothing. Better that he simply not come back. Many of the men who went over the wire at Cowra had already been mourned. Funerals had been held for them. Their names had been read out. They had been buried at home while they were still alive in New South Wales, and they had arranged it that way themselves. By August of 1944, there were 2,223 Japanese prisoners in Australia, and the largest single concentration of them sat in one compound outside a town of 3,000 people. Very few people in the army that guarded them had any idea what had been delivered into their custody. The camp itself had been built for somebody else entirely. The first men through the gate, in October of 1941, were Italians from the North African campaign, and they helped build the place that would hold them. The site sat 2 miles outside Cowra, 314 kilometres west of Sydney, and covered more than 30 hectares in a shape very nearly a perfect circle. 2 roads crossed at the centre and quartered it, one east and west called No Man's Land, the other north and south, lit so brightly after dark that a man could read by it, which the garrison called Broadway. 6 towers stood around the perimeter, each with a searchlight, and the wire ran in 3 rows of about 6 feet with entanglement between them. A and C were Italian. D held Japanese officers with Koreans and Formosans. B compound, the northeastern quarter, held 1,104 Japanese other ranks in a space built for 1,000. The Italians are the part of this that matters most and gets discussed least. They had fought hard in North Africa, they had been beaten, and they regarded that as one of the ordinary possibilities of soldiering. They worked the surrounding farms and were content to wait out a war they could no longer influence. And at one point, the guards found a still in their compound, which tells you most of what you need to know about the temperature of life in A and C. The men of the 22nd Garrison Battalion spent 3 years learning what a prisoner of war was, and everything they learned came from watching the Italians. It was an excellent education in the wrong subject. 200 meters away, across a lit road, was a compound of men who had reached the opposite conclusion about their own situation, and the guards looked at them and saw prisoners. Who those guards were is the entire moral content of what happened later. Militia garrison battalions were where the Australian Army put the men it could not send anywhere else. Older men from the reserve, veterans of the First World War, some past 60, veterans of New Guinea who had come home unfit to go back. Young men graded out on medical examination. They were issued older pattern rifles and organised into 4 companies of roughly 100, 1 to each compound, and they had been guarding a wheel of wire in a paddock for 3 years without anything happening. It was not a regiment in any sense the word usually carries, and it was not a garrison in the sense the Army meant when it used the term elsewhere. It was a collection of men the country had already assessed and set aside, given a fence to watch. Benjamin Gower Hardy was born at Marrickville in Sydney on the 28th of August, 1898, the 3rd child of an English perfume manufacturer. He drove for Dalgety and Company, and he lived at Willoughby with his sister and his widowed mother, and he never married. The description that survives of him is unusually specific for a man of no public importance. Tall, shy, the sort who repaired his neighbours' appliances without being asked, who brought home animals that had nowhere else to go, and who fished whenever he could get to water. There is one other thing in the record. He shot with the Chatswood Rifle Club, and in 1926 he won its championship. He was mobilised at 43, and the Army judged him too old for active service and sent him to a garrison battalion, where he became recognised as the unit's authority on the Vickers machine gun. That is a peculiar sentence to have to write. The Vickers was a water-cooled weapon of First World War design, heavy, slow to move, magnificent when static, and useless to a country fighting in jungle. A man who understood it thoroughly held a skill the Australian Army of 1942 had very little use for. On the 12th of February, 1944, he was posted to Cowra. He had been there less than 6 months. Ralph Jones was born at Gorleston in Norfolk on the 26th of September, 1900, the youngest of 14 children of a journeyman wheelwright. He left school at 14. A classmate who remembered him decades later described him as shy, withdrawn, and far from robust, which is a fair summary of a childhood at the bottom of a family that size. He went into the British Army at the very end of the First World War and served a year with the Army of Occupation on the Rhine before being invalided out in April of 1920 with tuberculosis. He recovered as far as he was going to recover. He could not find permanent work in Britain, and around 1926 he emigrated to Australia and became a labourer in Sydney. And when the Depression took that away, he moved through the bush, picking up what casual work there was. In the 1930s, he settled at Tweena, boarding with a farm worker named Tom Cook and his wife, Madeline. The citizen military forces took him in January of 1942, and on the form where a soldier records the person to be notified in the event of his death, Ralph Jones entered nothing at all. Both parents were gone. Whatever remained of 13 brothers and sisters was on the other side of the world and had not seen him in 16 years. Later, he went back and filled the space in. He wrote down Madeline Cook, and beside her name, in the box provided for the relationship, he wrote the word friend. In February, he was posted to Cowra, and he stayed there until he died. The third man was Charles Henry Shepherd, a Sydney boy, born on the 18th of February, 1913. By 1937, he was living at Young, married to a woman named Linda Irene, and they had 3 daughters. He enlisted 3 weeks after Pearl Harbor, and the medical examination found that he was blind in the left eye. He was graded fit for base or garrison service only, and in early 1943 he was put into B Company at Cowra, which was the company that guarded the Japanese. There was also a private named Alfred Rolls, who was 40 years old, and who will matter later for about 90 seconds. That was the arrangement. Australia had taken the men it had graded out as too old, too sick, too slow and too blind to be of use in the war, collected them in one place, and given them custody of 1,100 men who had already privately concluded that they were dead. On the 19th of February, 1942, a Japanese naval fighter pilot flew the first combat mission of his life. Hajime Toyoshima had joined the carrier Hiryu as a replacement after Pearl Harbor, which means the raid on Darwin was the first time he had ever fired a weapon in anger. His Zero took damage over the harbor, and he put it down on Melville Island, and he walked away from it with facial injuries and one very clear idea in his head. He moved away from the aeroplane as fast as he could go, because he understood what he had just given the Allies. Before that morning, only 9 Zeros had come into Allied hands, all shot down at Pearl Harbor, and all wreckage. His was substantially intact, and it would be examined, measured, and flown. He was captured on the 24th of February by a Tiwi man named Matthias Ulungura, who had grown up hunting that country and who was not armed. The story that has come down is that Ulungura came up behind him and pressed a stick into his back to imitate a rifle muzzle. He walked him to Bathurst Island and handed him to Sergeant Leslie Powell of the Royal Australian Engineers, who was also unarmed and who escorted Australia's first Japanese prisoner of war into captivity using the prisoner's own service pistol. Toyoshima gave the name Tadao Minami, which was his brother's given name, and at Cowra he was known for his ear for music. Somewhere in that compound was a brass bugle made by Boosey and Hawkes of London in the 1930s. How an English band instrument came to be in the possession of a Japanese prisoner in a paddock in central New South Wales is not recorded and has never been established. The best guess is that it was issued for entertainment, like the baseball bats. It is an object with no history and one future, and it sat in a hut for the better part of 2 years, waiting for the single note anyone would ever remember it for. 16 months before any of this, a Japanese non-commissioned officer walked out of B compound on his own, and nobody could work out how. He was picked up after 9 hours. At the inquiry, he was invited to demonstrate his method, and he did. He crossed all 3 rows of 6-foot fence and the entangled wire between them in 2 minutes and 40 seconds, and he smoked a cigarette from beginning to end while he did it. The camp's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Montague Ambrose Brown, had been judged too old for active service in 1939, like so many of the men he now commanded. After the demonstration, he wrote to the military authorities in Sydney and asked for the camp to be strengthened. The fences at Cowra remained until the night of the breakout, scarcely taller than the average man. In June of 1944, a Korean prisoner told the guards that the Japanese were discussing a mass outbreak. This time, Sydney listened. 2 Vickers machine guns arrived, each on a 4-wheeled trailer, along with extra Owen and Bren guns, and a sentry post was established permanently at the centre of Broadway after dark. Those were the measures taken. Not more guards, not fewer weapons in the huts, not a higher fence, but 2 machine guns and a chair in the middle of a lit road. There was no increase in the number of guards, on the reasoning that more men firing into the same space would risk hitting each other. And there was no increase in hut searches. That last decision deserves a moment, because of what was in the huts. Standing orders required that the mess knives issued to B compound be counted after every meal and locked away. They were not counted. They were not locked away. Over months, in 20 huts, the prisoners built an arsenal out of the ordinary furniture of camp life. Cutlery filed into blades, wire worked into stilettos, garden tools, cords for garroting, clubs studded with nails, and the baseball bats the Australian Army had issued for recreation. When the moment came, they went over the wire wearing baseball gloves, also issued by the Australian Army, to grip the barbed wire. So the camp received a warning that its prisoners were planning to come out, and responded by acquiring the means to kill them rather than removing the means by which they intended to leave. By that winter, the garrison had 2 machine guns it had never needed, 20 huts it had never searched, and 1,100 men waiting for something to happen. They were given it on a Friday afternoon. On the 4th of August, 1944, Major Robert Ramsay summoned 3 men to his office. Ramsay was a decorated officer of the First World War, and he commanded B Compound. And there is one fact about him that the record states plainly, and then leaves alone. His own son, also called Robert, had been a prisoner of the Japanese since the fall of Singapore in February of 1942. The 3 men who came in were Sergeant Major Akira Kanazawa, Sergeant Masao Kojima, and the man the Australians knew as Tadao Minami. Ramsay told them that 700 prisoners, every man below the rank of Lance Corporal, would be moved to the camp at Hay, 400 kilometres further west. The 3 of them objected at length. The Japanese in that compound were a family, they said, and they had to stay together. Ramsay was not interested. He told them to have the men ready to move on Monday morning. He had told them it all because he was required to. Article 26 of the Geneva Convention of 1929 obliges a detaining power to give prisoners advance notice of a transfer, and the Australians, who had run that camp by the book for 3 years, gave the notice. There is no version of this story in which the Australian administration behaved improperly at this point. They followed the rule. The rule is what killed them. The reason it did lies in something the Australians had no way of weighing. Within the Japanese Army, the relationship between non-commissioned officers and the men under them was understood in terms of older and younger brothers, and it carried obligations that did not lapse. To be separated from the men you were responsible for by an enemy, on a timetable set by that enemy, was not an administrative inconvenience. For men who had already lost everything else that defined them, it was the removal of the last thing they had. Kanazawa went back to the compound and called a meeting of the 20 hut leaders. The men were divided into groups of about 30, hut by hut, and the leaders were told to explain the situation and then to establish by ballot how much support there was for a mass outbreak. Many of them handed out blank slips of paper with the same instruction. Mark it with a circle if you are for it. Mark it with a cross if you are against. The argument went on through the afternoon and into the evening, hut by hut, and when it was finished, the result was far from unanimous, and in some huts the leaders reported figures that did not match what their men had written. Marikuni Takahara marked a circle, and admitted afterwards that he had wanted to mark a cross. He was not the only one. What happened at Cowra has been described ever since as though 1,100 men rose as one, and it was nothing of the kind. It was a compound of men taught that their own lives were already forfeit, asked to put that proposition to a vote, on paper, in groups of 30, and failing to agree about it. The terms were settled that night. Any man too badly injured to go over the wire could recover his honor by taking his own life before it started. No civilian was to be harmed. The signal would be a bugle at 2 in the morning. The huts would be fired at the same moment, and the compound would go out in 4 groups: north into the machine guns, east into open country, and 2 into Broadway, 1 to reach the officers in D compound and 1 to attack the gates. The weapons that had been accumulating for months were handed out in the dark, and then 1,104 men lay down and waited for the hours to pass. Private Alfred Rolls had the sentry post in the middle of Broadway that night, and it consisted of a canvas tent, a wooden office chair, and a telephone line back to the guardhouse. The night was hard with frost, which is worth holding on to, because the cold explains what people were wearing when it started. Rolls stamped his feet on the packed dirt to keep the blood moving in them, and waited for a shift that had been uneventful for 3 years to be uneventful again. Shortly before 2, he saw movement among the buildings in B compound. A figure was coming towards him, quickly, and it was not trying to be quiet. The man came over the inner gate and began speaking at him rapidly in Japanese. Rolls did not understand a single word of it. What he could see was a prisoner in visible panic on the wrong side of a fence at 2 in the morning. So he raised his rifle and fired 2 rounds into the air, which was the pre-arranged alarm. Then he went to the telephone, and it rang before he reached it. Inside the compound, a man in a hut doorway turned and shouted that there was an informer at the wire. A dozen prisoners came out after him and did not catch him in time. That was the moment the plan lost the only advantage it had. Toyoshima put the bugle to his mouth and blew, and the compound came apart. Hundreds of men came out of the huts at once, shouting, and 18 of the 21 sleeping huts went up behind them, lit deliberately, so that the men going over the wire would be going away from a fire, and the men shooting at them would be shooting into one. A round fired in those first seconds cut the main electricity line. Every searchlight in the camp died, and the rest of it happened by burning hut. They went at the wire with blankets wrapped around them and gloves on their hands. Some crawled underneath. Most did not. They threw the blankets across the barbs to flatten them, and where that was not enough, men threw themselves bodily onto the wire and lay there while the men behind climbed over their backs. The group that had spilled into Broadway found the prisoner who had run to the gate. They clubbed him down, cut his throat, and kicked the body aside. The camp had 2 machine guns, and the men who ran to them were 45 and 43 years old. The guns stood on 4-wheeled trailers, the number 1 gun near the northern main gates, and the number 2 gun slightly to the east of it, which put number 2 directly in the path of the group that had been told to go north. When Rolls's 2 rounds went off, both crews came out of their quarters at a dead run, and Hardy and Jones pulled greatcoats on over their pajamas as they went. They reached the trailer while the northern group was still coming through the wire. What that group had been asked to do was, on any honest reading, a suicide assault, to cross open ground into 2 belt-fed machine guns so the men going east had less attention on them. They did it anyway. Hardy got the gun into action, and Jones fed the belt, and they fired into the charge, and the charge did not stop. Men went down on the wire, and the men behind them came over the top of the bodies, and kept coming, and closed the distance. Both of them could have walked away, and no one would have criticized them. The gun was 1 gun. 2 middle-aged privates abandoning an untenable position would have been an unremarkable decision that nobody would have written down. There was no officer at the trailer. No order was given to hold. Nobody was watching them who could have made them stay. Not doctrine, not discipline, not any reasonable assessment of what 2 men might achieve against several hundred, but a decision taken in the dark by two middle-aged privates, with a few seconds in which to take it. Hardy stopped firing. He told Jones to run. Then he lifted the top cover of the Vickers, took out the feed block, and threw it away into the dark. They came over the trailer and killed him where he sat. Ralph Jones, stabbed in the chest and in the back, got clear of them somehow and made it as far as the number 1 gun, where he said a couple of words to the crew and fell down dead. Nobody wrote down what he said. It is possible nobody heard it properly over the noise, and it is possible that whoever did hear it thought there would be time later to ask him about it. Whatever the last thing Ralph Jones said in his life was, it is not in the record, and it is not going to be. The Japanese reached the trailer, swung the gun around, and it would not fire. That is the whole of it. Everything the 4,000 people inside that wire depended on for the next 20 minutes came down to a belt-fed weapon in enemy hands refusing to work. They tried to make it work. They had watched it firing at them from 30 meters away moments earlier, and had every reason to think it would fire for them. And while they were establishing why it would not, the guards with rifles closed the distance and killed all of them on and around the trailer. The number 1 gun kept firing across the northern approach and eventually broke the assault there entirely. Precisely why the gun failed has never been settled, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. One account has Hardy removing the feed block. Another has him removing the bolt. A third credits Jones with taking out the lock and hiding it. And the Australian Dictionary of Biography, the most careful of them, records that nobody disabled anything, and that the weapon jammed because the men who seized it swung the gun without swinging the ammunition belt with it. What is not in dispute is that the gun did not fire, that the delay was fatal to the men working at it, and that neither Hardy nor Jones left that trailer. Somewhere in the frost outside a fence in New South Wales that morning, there was a rectangle of machined steel about the size of a man's hand. Nobody photographed it, and nobody kept it. On that object, or on the failure to swing a canvas belt through 90 degrees, turned the only occasion in the Second World War on which an organised enemy force fought Australian troops on Australian soil. Both men were awarded the George Cross. While the northern assault was breaking apart, 3 other things were happening at once, and the men involved in each could see almost nothing of the others. At the northern end of Broadway, guards were firing rifles and a Bren gun into the prisoners who had rushed the main gates. Guards at the southern end were firing into the group attacking their own end, and the 2 fields of fire met in the middle of a lit road. 3 Australians were hit by their own side. 1 prisoner got over the northern gates. He came down inside the perimeter with an improvised dagger and reached the guard room as Charles Shepherd was stepping out of it. He put the knife through Shepherd's heart and killed him instantly. Ramsey saw it happen and ordered one of his men to shoot, and the prisoner died within a few yards of the man he had just killed. Of the several hundred who tried to get over that gate, exactly 1 succeeded, and the Australian he found was the one graded fit for garrison duty, only because he could not see out of his left eye. Out on the eastern side, near the tower the garrison called F, a private named Kevin Manser emptied all 5 magazines for his own gun, and then found he could not use his grenades, because the tower was too narrow for him to draw his arm back far enough to throw one. He watched from 9 meters up as blankets went over the wire below him, and the eastern group went out into the dark. Almost everyone who got away from Cowra that night got away past F Tower, and they did it there because they had spent weeks working out precisely where each tower could and could not shoot. When the sun came up, the wire on the eastern side was still hung with blankets, and scattered in the grass beyond were baseball gloves, dropped where men had pulled them off their hands. The army had issued them so the prisoners could play a game in the exercise yard. At the southern end of Broadway, the attempt to reach the officers in D compound failed, and the last man to fall was a Japanese medical officer shot through both thighs as he moved to join the surge. The whole thing had lasted about 30 minutes. There is one further fact the standard telling leaves out, and it changes the shape of the night. Roughly 2/3 of B compound never left the camp at all. Some stayed in their huts. Some killed themselves where they stood, which was what had been agreed for the men who could not run. Some had marked across the previous evening and saw no reason to change their minds because the count went the other way. The vote had not been unanimous, and neither was the night. The accounting ran as follows: 231 Japanese prisoners dead, according to the official history. The Australian War Memorial's own encyclopedia puts it at 234, and the difference has never been reconciled. 108 wounded. Of the dead, something in the order of 180 were killed by Australian fire, and the rest died by their own hand, or at the hands of other prisoners. Somewhere between 330 and 359 men were beyond the wire. 3 Australians were dead, and at least 3 more wounded, all of the wounded by fire from their own side. Among the bodies found after first light, in a ditch outside the perimeter, was the man who had blown the bugle. He had killed himself. He had been in Australian custody for 2.5 years, and he had spent all of it under his brother's name. The lights had been out for half an hour. When they came back on, the frost was still on the ground. By 7 o'clock that Saturday morning, the town knew. The Air Force flew over the district. The police worked the roads, trainee soldiers went out on foot, and farmers rode their own paddocks looking for men in maroon clothing. Escapees were picked up as far away as Cowra, more than 50 kilometres from the wire. Late on the afternoon of that first day, Lieutenant Harry Doncaster took a search party into wooded country northwest of the town. He was 38, a stonemason from North Ballarat, with a wife named Jessie and a son who was 7 years old. He had served in the Middle East before coming home to Darwin, and then to a training battalion at Cowra. The men he was leading were recruits, some of whom had been in the army a matter of weeks. They had not been issued firearms. In failing light, they came on 8 escapees, one standing on a large rock with a knife in his hand. For want of anything better, Doncaster picked up a stone. The man on the rock jumped down onto him, and the other 7 went for the recruits, and the recruits, by their own admission at the court of inquiry, lost their nerve and ran. None of them saw him alive again. When armed soldiers reached the place, they found he had been killed with a bayonet one of his own men had dropped while running. All 8 of the Japanese who killed him hanged themselves from trees nearby within days. He was 38 years old. He was a stonemason, and he died holding a stone. 2 evenings later, and 50 kilometres away at Blaney, a company of the Volunteer Defence Corps was assembling to patrol railway lines and bridges because the Department of Railways feared the escapees would attack them. Among those getting down from the truck was Sergeant Thomas Roy Hancock, who was 53. As the men dismounted, another soldier pulled his rifle from the front seat, and it discharged. Hancock was hit in the buttocks. A doctor was with him inside 5 minutes. He was operated on that night, and his recovery was expected. On the 14th of August, his temperature began to rise. He died of septicemia. A military court of inquiry recorded that his death had been occasioned indirectly by the escape from Cowra. He left a widow named Hattie, 2 grown children, and a son of 11 called John. Out in the paddocks, the Recapture was producing scenes nobody had prepared anyone for. 2 men threw themselves under an oncoming train. Some, when soldiers found them, asked to be shot and had to be refused. Others surrendered without any fuss at all. And then there is the other thing that happened in those paddocks, which is the reason this story is told in Cowra at all. 3 escapees walked up to a farmhouse looking for food. The woman who answered the door was May Weir, and she brought them inside and gave them tea and scones, while her daughter went quietly out the back and rode for the police. Her daughter Margaret described it afterwards. Her mother pouring tea and being the perfect hostess. As always, chatting away to these strange-looking gentlemen in maroon prison clothing and old felt hats. The family later worked out had come from their own shearing shed. The men thanked her and wandered off towards the creek, where they were sitting when the army arrived. 40 years later, Margaret Weir was invited to Japan, to the family home of one of them. Kanazawa's order had been that Australian soldiers were to be attacked and no civilian was to be touched. Over 9 days, with 350 desperate men loose in farming country full of isolated houses, not one civilian was harmed and not one house was broken into. The order was obeyed to the letter by men who had nothing further to lose by ignoring it. Every escapee was accounted for within 9 days. Not one had got anywhere, because there had never been anywhere to get to, and every man who went over that wire had known it before he went. On the 30th of August, 25 days after the breakout, the surviving prisoners of B Compound climbed into trucks and were driven 400 kilometres west to Hay. They had been living in tents since the 5th, having burned their own accommodation. The transfer they had voted to prevent, and had died in their hundreds to stop, went ahead on schedule, with the same men to the same destination. A press ban went into effect immediately. Nobody involved needed the logic of it explained. Approximately 22,000 Australians were prisoners of the Japanese, and whatever had happened in that paddock, the government was not going to publish anything that could be turned into a justification for what might be done to them. Nothing was said publicly for more than a month. On the 8th of September, 1944, Prime Minister John Curtin read a summary of the Court of Inquiry's findings to the House of Representatives, and the word he used was riot. Conditions had accorded with the Geneva Conventions. The outbreak was premeditated. The garrison's resistance had averted a greater loss of life, and firing had ceased as soon as control was assured. The attack, the inquiry recorded, had been characterized by a suicidal disregard of life. Japanese radio put out a different account. The dead could not have been prisoners of war, because Japanese soldiers do not surrender, and what had taken place was the cold-blooded murder of civilian internees. The Australian findings went to Tokyo through the Swiss consulate in Sydney, and the Swiss conducted an inquiry of their own and confirmed them. Then the war ended. The 22,000 came home, or the ones who were going to come home did. The reason for the secrecy expired, and the secrecy did not. The George Crosses were announced in September of 1950, 6 years and 1 month after the 2 men died. Ben Hardy's mother had waited the whole of that time. She died a few days after the announcement was made public. The medal was presented to his sister Beatrice by the Governor-General in Sydney on the 21st of January, 1952. Ralph Jones's was presented to his brother Walter by King George VI, and it is held today by the Cowra Shire Council in the town where he was killed. The 2 citations read almost identically, which is appropriate because the 2 men did the same thing at the same moment for the same reason. Each records a mass outbreak never before witnessed in the history of the British Empire, and a soldier who stood his ground and continued to work his gun until he was bashed to death. They also described the prisoners as fanatical and as men worked up to a state of frenzy, and that language belongs to 1950 and should be left there. The men who came over that wire were not in a frenzy. They had held a ballot. Which leaves the questions the record does not answer. Why did a camp shown 16 months in advance that its fences could be crossed in under 3 minutes by a man smoking a cigarette never raise those fences? Why were mess knives that standing orders required to be counted after every meal never once counted? Why were recruits with a few weeks of service sent out after armed and suicidal men without weapons of their own? The answers, such as they are administrative. Not a court-martial, not a public finding, not one sentence anybody had to read aloud in a courtroom, but a set of retirement dates. Subsequent inquiries found that Brown and Ramsey had erred greatly before the breakout and during it. Neither was reprimanded. Ramsey retired 8 weeks after the night in question. Brown retired in March of 1945. And Thomas Roy Hancock, whose death a military inquiry had formally attributed to the breakout, does not appear on the Australian War Memorial's Roll of Honour. For most of a century, the count of Australians killed at Cowra has been 4. The art installation erected in the town for the 75th anniversary says 5. Nobody has ever publicly explained the difference. The camp ran until 1947. Then it was dismantled, and the wire and fencing that had held 4,000 people was sold off to the farmers whose land surrounded it. In 1946, the Cowra branch of the Returned and Services League took on the care of the Australian war graves outside the town. Having done that, they looked over the fence. On the other side were the Japanese graves, overgrown and effectively abandoned, in a country where feeling about the Japanese in 1946 was not moderate and had no reason to be. Some of the men who looked over that fence had fought them. Albert Oliver had served in North Africa and then in New Guinea and Borneo, and his son Len remembered how the reasoning went. These were soldiers who had fought for their own country, and they at least deserved the respect. So they started holding working bees, and they kept doing it, year after year, without anybody asking them to, and without any of it being reported anywhere. In 1963, the Japanese government made arrangements to repatriate its war dead from Australia. When its representatives came to Cowra, they found 523 graves in a condition nobody had prepared them for, and they changed their minds. Rather than take the bodies home, they asked permission to establish an official Japanese war cemetery on the site, and the land was ceded, and it opened on the 4th of August 1964, 20 years and 1 day after the breakout. It holds the 231 men killed that night, along with Japanese aircrew shot down over northern Australia and civilian internees who died in custody. It is the only Japanese war cemetery anywhere in the world outside Japan. Beside it is the Cowra War Cemetery, where 4 of the 5 Australians are buried, Hardy and Jones and Shepherd and Doncaster, in the same plot and the same row. An avenue of cherry trees runs from the cemeteries to the ground where the compound stood. None of this was one-sided. In Japan, where former prisoners were expected to spend their lives concealing the fact, some did the opposite and formed an association called Cowra Kai, whose president spoke publicly about what the Australian Army had done for men who arrived half dead out of New Guinea. Marakuni Takahara, who had marked a circle while wishing he had marked a cross, went home after the war to a family that had already held his funeral. They called him a ghost. Teruo Murakami came back to Cowra twice, at 93 and again at 98. And at the second visit, he pressed his palms together and offered, through an interpreter, an apology to the town. He had voted for the breakout, he said, because he had wanted to die. Asked when he had stopped believing death was the only thing, he thought about it and said that was a hard question. He died in Japan on the 14th of September, 2023. There is now nobody living who was inside that compound. The sergeant who said it had been a ridiculous thought, that they would even try it, was not being callous, and he was not making an excuse. He was describing, with more accuracy than he probably intended, the exact limit of what one set of men could imagine about another. Every decision made at that camp across 3 years was made inside that limit. And so was the transfer order. And so was the decision not to raise the fences. And so was the decision not to count the knives. Australia took the men it had graded out, the too old, the tubercular, the blind in one eye, and gave them the one place in the country where a battle would be fought. Those men did what was asked of them, and 2 of them did considerably more, and the country that sent them said nothing at all for 6 years, handed one of them a medal his mother lived 4 days to hear about, and left the 5th man off the list entirely. The distance between what those men did and what their country was prepared to say about it is where the real history of the Australian home front is written. Ralph Jones had no next of kin to name. Ben Hardy's mother died 4 days after they told her. Charles Shepherd left 3 daughters. Harry Doncaster left a boy of 7. Thomas Roy Hancock is not on the list. The wire was sold to the farmers. The grass over the Japanese graves has been cut, by somebody, every year since 1946. If you think those men are worth remembering, leave a comment below. And if you want to understand what happens when 2 countries send soldiers to fight, who cannot imagine each other at all, watch this next.